So I'm Joe Mullings, and welcome to The Other Side. There are people who are futurists. There are people who are visionaries, and sometimes they can see things coming, and sometimes they create the future. My guest is Chris Velis. Chris is one of those people who can see things well before they occur. He proves that out with being one of the founders of Oris, the robotics company that J&J just bought for billions of dollars, and also the founder and CEO of Miraki Innovation. And Miraki is focusing on, and Chris, if I'm incorrect, please correct me, but on seeing the future of diagnosing disease, and especially these that we're dealing with right now with COVID. Chris, thanks for coming on the show from Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Well, Joe, thank you. Your introduction is way too kind. I think you were spot on. I'd say that we're focused on solving the world's big MedTech and healthcare problems and enabling teams to tackle them with next generation technology. And yes, you're right. One of the areas that we've been concerned about for a very long time is infectious disease and antibiotic resistance, and of course, epidemic and pandemics.
And your technology, I have a quote here: "When a pandemic happens, remember that we told you it would. And if it does not happen, it will be because we took action and prevented it." Where's that from, Chris?
Well, it's from maybe my internal panic a few years ago when I started thinking about antibiotic resistance and raided the bookshelf on my Kindle and at Barnes and Noble and just bought everything I could, and said, is this an underinvested area where we're not concerned enough? And that's where it came from. It was sort of the warning to my team and the people we were talking to. And when I say we take action to prevent it, I didn't just mean my organization, Miraki, but really collectively all those partners and people we work with in the academic institutions and the government agencies and the major corporations around the world. The intent was to bring them together and sound an alarm. And I'll tell you, it was very hard to have that voice heard, until the last few weeks.
Yeah. And in your commercialization, the technology, some of this has been the genesis out of the Department of Defense's elite research DARPA group, as well as Harvard and the Harvard's Weiss Institute, in the anticipation of such a crisis. And you're forming organizations around that to head this off.
Yeah, there are a variety of government organizations, nonprofit organizations, and major companies that have been worried about this issue. And it's broader than this issue, right? It's antimicrobial and antibacterial resistance. It is our ability to track and see these things coming. It is the environmental change and economic changes that are changing the world in a way that makes us more susceptible to these pathogens. So, we were concerned about a variety of things, and the one that struck me first was that sepsis, which is massive systemic infection, is a killer that has a larger impact and death toll than cancer on an annual basis, for example. And most people can't tell you what sepsis is. So it all sort of started. It started there, Joe. But you're correct. We did begin to bring organizations together and ask questions. And I think in the U.S. we're very fortunate and can feel very good that we have a tremendous center of CDC, that we have BARDA with an interest in protecting the public, and the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense in particular is a major source of research funding, and their DARPA unit is kind of the Do the Impossible group. And they and Harvard University joined together some time ago and committed about $150 million to develop technologies to treat sepsis antimicrobial resistance, and to be prepared for epidemics and pandemics.
You know, you mentioned $150 million, and that might be the gas bill for a training weekend for Abrams tanks for the military. Yet look at what we're facing right now with that small drop in the bucket investment. You and I know the investments that need to go into technology in the MedTech world. I've heard this referred to as a black swan, but a black swan is something you can't see coming, yet people like you and Bill Gates saw this coming a few years ago. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm not sure I want to allow you to put me in a class with somebody like Bill Gates, who's so successful. I appreciate the reference, but really, my understanding of it came not only from him and his organization pointed out, but frankly, the World Health Organization and the Center for Disease Control has been on record for some time saying that we should be aware of these things. And if you go all the way back to antibiotics and their invention, the inventor in his Nobel Prize acceptance basically warned us of antimicrobial resistance. And Lister, who created aseptic environments for surgery, also kind of warned us of the same thing. There have been epidemic and pandemic after pandemic that have taken tolls on millions and millions of people, and whether it's this COVID-19 or whether it's Ebola or whether it was a Spanish flu or cholera, there's a very long list of these things, and you're right, they are predictable. It's happened before, it will happen again. It's a fact of biology.
Yeah, and these have been running, as you pointed out, pandemics. I think in 1918, what did it kill? 50 million people in that influenza pandemic. We'll see what happens here. Certainly, I hope the numbers don't approach that. And yet, we think because we're in the 21st century and we've got this elite, untouchable, sentient feeling about us, I think we underclub and underestimate this at times. But we're more connected than ever because of the ability to travel so easily, and therefore we can transport this so easily.
That's exactly right. I mean, we feel invincible because we've had antibiotics, we've had inoculations, we've had pasteurizations, we've had aseptic surgery, sterile surgery. But it's very hard to keep ahead of viruses and bacteria which outnumber and outweigh us. And you're right, there are a bunch of factors that make this really tricky. First is airlines, right? Cholera traveled around the world in the hull of ships, and it was accelerated when we went from wooden ships to steel ships because the steel ships had water in their hulls, and that water carried the cholera from country to country around the world. Ships were slower, populations were less dense. Today we're living in a world where we have airplanes, and any virus or bacteria can hitch a ride. And that's sort of exacerbated by what I'd say are two other factors that make this very probable. The first is increasing population density and the emergence of mega cities with 10 or more million people, where people are very, very close together. Environmental change, where hot areas are becoming hotter, cold areas becoming colder, wet areas wetter, dry areas drier. And that means that we're going to be susceptible to things, for example, in the United States, that you wouldn't normally think of. So malaria, which is somebody else's problem for the most part, I think, from an American perspective. Well, when we begin to see it in Florida and then North Carolina and then New Jersey, because of global warming, we're going to realize that these are global problems, and we're going to increasingly face them.
And Chris, while being a prolific entrepreneur and a founder of companies, you're also a businessman. And so, for a moment, how does this affect business in general across the world? Whether it's a supply chain, whether it's investment. I know you've explored those areas as well.
Yeah, there's so much to say on this topic, and I think it's important to actually make a little bit of a separation, because we think about treating the virus, we think about treating COVID-19. But if you take a step back and you think of an epidemic or a pandemic as having symptoms itself, one are the symptoms of making people sick. There's a secondary symptom of potentially overwhelming our healthcare system. For example, being in Cambridge in the Boston area with Newton Wellesley Hospital, I heard yesterday Newton Wellesley Hospital has only 4 free beds for emergency patients. Now, of course, we have a major hospital system in Boston and one of the best in the world. But the idea that these systems and others could be overwhelmed with patients is an economic factor for the entire healthcare system. But it goes beyond that, because as people are out of work, we've asked most of our team, except for those working on COVID-19 stuff, to work from home. And there's a major disruption in the supply chain. And one example I give you is just the automotive industry. A lot of parts coming from China, those parts come to the US manufacturers, the Japanese manufacturers, and also the German manufacturers. That's off more than 15% now. We think the auto supply is going to be down more than 15%. The first quarter of this year, the Geneva Auto Show was canceled. And you think about that, those repercussions going through the entire economic system, right? That means people in manufacturing lines unemployed. That means people in dealerships not working, and it goes on and on. Certainly the same goes for the airline industry and all those businesses that are affiliated, restaurants, health, hotels, even your local coffee shop. And this is on a global basis. So I think this type of thing is potentially going to be the cause of global recessionary or depressionary environment, and may in the long run create some pent-up demand. But epidemics and pandemics have all of these side effects and symptoms. I'm going to mention one more, and that is the psychological and emotional side effect and impact it has on people. And I'm sure, Joe, as you've gone around and gone to your local coffee shop or talked to people you're working with, they're just not quite the same. I mean, there's rampant fear and anxiety, lack of understanding, and that's a symptom of pandemic.
That's your appointment, Chris, for the next cape you have to put on and go save somebody.
No cape. I hope we can save somebody, though.
Yeah, but the emotional baggage and and I call it baggage, but it's justified baggage is, the human mind wants to always have a story in it. And right now, I think it's incumbent on people like yourself, myself, and our professionals in the MedTech industry to help put the story in there that's going to be empowering and educational. And sometimes the truth hurts, but it's better off giving people the truth right now so they can deal with it versus the story they put in their head.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges here is, even though World Health Organization, CDC, and others warned of this, even though we've seen it before, I think globally, both the U.S. government and others are not fully prepared. And so even our leaders, I think, have not had enough knowledge, nor the infrastructure, enough systems in place to share accurate information quickly. And we'll learn from this and we'll get better at it. But you can see us stumbling over ourselves with leaders thinking that maybe a flu inoculation will help contain this, misunderstanding exactly what a diagnostic means and what it does. These are things that we're going to have to solve going forward.
You mentioned the word flu, and we think about vaccination. Is this a one and done disease, Chris, or pandemic, or is this going to be seasonal to the best of your knowledge?
I don't know. I ask these questions of people who are much better with the science and biology of this, and I don't think they know. If you stand back at it from it, though, I think the way to look at this is maybe not seasonal like flu, but to look at the potential for any bacteria, virus, protozoa, or fungi to have this kind of impact if it has the right sort of characteristics in terms of being contagious and the right characteristics in terms of it affecting people's health. I think in reality, this could be even worse if it hid in patients for an even longer period of time and was transmittable during that period of time, and if the onset of the symptoms was even more acute. For example, as it was in cholera, where people died, within a day or within hours of the onset of symptoms. This could be worse. Don't get me wrong; it's very, very bad and difficult for us to measure and get a handle on as it is. But this should be a warning shot to all of us and to leaders around the world that we need to be much better prepared for this.
The U.S. House of Reps voted to approve a coronavirus preparedness and response supplement for about $8 billion for funding. Is that going to be enough? And is that just a start of what we need to prepare for versus putting massive amounts of trillions of dollars, again, into the military? Is this our new, quote unquote, world enemy?
Yeah, I think it is fair to call it an enemy. Hopefully, in that it's not another human being, as a bacteria or a virus or protozoa, will come together as humanity and say this is something we need to get ahead of. We're outnumbered by something that mutates faster and that there are many more of than there are humans. My greatest hope is it will bring us together. Do I think $8 billion is enough? Over the long run, no. I think it is a starting point to try to implement some measures to get this under control and keep Americans as safe as possible and citizens around the world as safe as possible. But in the long run, we're going to need to begin to treat infectious disease just like we would treat those things we live with every day and manage every day, like cancer, diabetes, and heart disease. Just because they come and go and disappear and they're acute and we have reprieves from them doesn't mean that we shouldn't treat them as a constant threat, and not just a threat to us individually or the elderly or the infirm, but a threat to our economic system, a threat to our way of living.
Yeah, and it's going to be super interesting, Chris, and you and I stand on the sidelines and watch this and watch politicians use the healthcare system as a tool to get elected, and we watch Wall Street use our healthcare system to make money and rent stocks and never take a full vested interest in it. But now that they haven't paid mind to arguably the most important market in the world, they're all going to feel it. And I'm just going to be curious to see if the respect is given to the market, because it really is at the forefront of keeping everybody alive. And sometimes you need a common enemy. And perhaps this is that common enemy that will have people wake up and not just have a WHO for a placeholder, but instead perhaps that's where money should go in order to keep the world a safer place.
Joe, I couldn't agree more. I think that's exactly on target.
What can we do as a community, the MedTech industry and the biotech and life sciences industry? What can we start to do better in order to get out ahead of this, as we know we should?
So, I envision a whole bunch of changes, but let's begin with the investors that support our venture capital community, that support the major strategics and the companies that make up our healthcare system. They need support. One of the things, being a venture investor, that I frequently hear is that MedTech is a 0-1 game. It takes a long time. It's extremely risky. We don't understand it. It's easier to write software code. And that sort of belies an understanding of the real time frames and challenges in medical technology. They're not always as steep as we talk about, and you can see the entire MedTech community flipping on a dime to make progress when it's necessary. And the reality is that in many cases we're very able to do that. And so I think it is incumbent upon us to educate investors about the realities, about the way that the healthcare environment and system is changing, and for investors to listen very carefully. In all the times that I've told there's no investment thesis in medical technology, I'll remind people we started a surgical robotics company off of concepts at Columbia and Johns Hopkins University, which became worth nearly $6 billion in one of the largest venture funded exits ever. There is an investment thesis. If the industry doesn't have sufficient investment in capital to translate the technology that is sitting within our academic institutions into products that reach the patients who need it, then we're going to find ourselves constantly in situations like this and not advancing medicine. And it's incumbent upon our industry to really spend time with investors and educate them. I also think it's incumbent upon the government to support the infrastructure of our industry. We put massive amounts of money into research at academic institutions, but the amount of research that's piled up, I'm right in the center of Harvard Square right now, and I'm looking at a dozen labs outside my window that's piled up at Harvard, at MIT, Columbia, Johns Hopkins, Stanford, University of Iowa, Utah for that matter, that could be translated and meaningful to patients is incredible. Making that accessible, creating a strong venture community environment to translate it, educating investors, I think is critically important, and that's going to require the hand of I think, government to do that.
Yeah. It's always super interesting to chat with you, Chris. I think you bring an unbelievable perspective. I thank you for really the time. I know you're really busy. You dropped everything you were working on to come sit in on this, and it's going to be valuable to share with our community in the world. Anything before we wrap out? Where can we find you on Miraki Innovation? You mentioned Cambridge and Harvard Square. You're right up there in the epicenter of the biotech world in Cambridge.
We are. We're right dead center of Harvard University, looking at the campus up my window now. MIT is a stone throw, Boston University across the street, and the Longwood Medical Center, and all the great hospitals we have. But we collaborate with hospitals and academic institutions around the world. We're trying to bring everybody together around problems like this. We think it takes a very collaborative environment. So this is where you can find me, and people are welcome to call and visit. You are always welcome. I'm really grateful for what you're doing, because you're doing what we're trying to do, is bring the medical technology community together, develop understanding and a collaborative environment. And your efforts around your media and your network are really incredible. I'm grateful for it, and grateful for you including me in it.
Yeah, I'm fortunate to be able to have access to world movers and shakers and just good human beings like you. So I appreciate the time on this, and I'll let you get back to figuring out a way to get us through this.
Well, we've got some technology we think is important, and we're keeping our ears open for other stuff that we can move along quickly. So we're doing our best. Joe, I hope you and your family stay safe, and everybody who's listening, stay safe, stay healthy. We'll get over this. Most of all, stay together.
You got it. And I'll see you on the other side, my friend.